Atiku Abubakar just called Goodluck Jonathan inexperienced. Not in a private conversation, not in a leaked memo, on national television in April 2026, in front of the entire country. The man who has been chasing the Nigerian presidency for the better part of 3 decades looked into a camera on Arise TV and described a former head of state, a man who served as deputy governor, acting governor, governor, vice president, acting president and president of the Federal Republic as someone who lacked the experience to manage the affairs of the country, particularly when he was faced with challenges. And Goodluck Jonathan fired back, quietly, calmly. At a diplomatic ceremony in Abuja, he reminded the room and anyone watching that during his presidency, Nigeria secured a seat on the United Nations Security Council twice. If I was so naive, Jonathan said, I don't think I would have been able to navigate through that process. That exchange is what the press is reporting. A personal feud between 2 aging politicians, 2 men with history, trading barbs. But here is what nobody is actually asking. And this is the question that should stop you in your tracks. Why did Atiku Abubakar choose this specific moment, April 2026, with the ADC primary battle heating up, with coalition negotiations in their most fragile stage, to publicly reduce a former president from the South-South? What political calculation requires Jonathan to be made small right now? That question, who benefits from Jonathan being labeled incompetent at this precise moment, is the thread this entire analysis is going to pull. Because the answer is not what you think. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let's establish exactly what happened and why the timing matters more than the insult itself. On April 15, 2026, Atiku Abubakar sat down for a live interview on Arise TV's primetime program. The conversation ranged across his 2027 ambitions, his position within the African Democratic Congress, his views on zoning, his case for why Nigeria needs his leadership now. And somewhere in that conversation, he turned to Goodluck Jonathan's record and said, and this is a direct quote, "I know Goodluck Jonathan very well. He's a decent young man, but also inexperienced, and I believe that contributed to his inability to manage the affairs of the country, particularly when he was faced with challenges." 6 days later, on April 21st, at the 2025 awards ceremony of the Association of Retired Career Ambassadors of Nigeria in Abuja, Jonathan responded. He did not name Atiku directly. He said, "So, not too long ago, a very senior politician said, 'Oh, Jonathan was too young and probably that's why he made mistakes.' And then he went on to defend his record with specifics, the UN security seats, his diplomatic navigation, his acknowledgement that yes, every leader makes mistakes, and no, the fact that he made mistakes does not erase what he built." The press framed it as a back and forth, 2 political veterans having a moment. That framing is convenient and it is completely wrong. Here is the historical context you need. Before the 2011 PDP primary, Atiku Abubakar was positioned as the North's consensus presidential pick. He arrived at that primary with momentum, with backing, with the expectation that the process would move in his direction. And then Goodluck Jonathan, the same inexperienced leader, outmaneuvered him at the primary and walked away with the ticket. That loss never fully healed. And the man who inflicted it has spent the years since as an informal power center in the South-South, a region that sits at the exact center of every coalition calculation in the 2027 race. Now here is the fact that reframes everything, and most political commentators have not put this together yet. Analysts who have mapped the 2023 election results in detail have established that the combined vote total of Atiku, Peter Obi, and Kwantaso exceeded 15 million. Nearly double what Tinubu received. On paper, a unified opposition coalition doesn't just compete. In 2027, it wins. But that arithmetic only holds together if the South-South stays in the opposition column, and Goodluck Jonathan's network is the informal gatekeeper to a significant portion of that column. Attacking his competence is not a personal grievance. It's a preemptive strike on a vote block that someone inside the ADC coalition could leverage against Atiku himself.
Now, let's go deeper. Because what is happening inside the ADC right now is far more complex than the public narrative suggests. The African Democratic Congress currently houses, under one roof, Atiku Abubakar, Peter Obi, Rotimi Ameichi, Rabiu Musa Kwankwaso, and Mohammed Hayatuddin. Every single one of them has presidential ambitions. Every single one of them ran or was positioned to run in 2023. And the plan, as Atiku himself described it on Arise TV, is to first seek a consensus and only move to direct primaries if consensus fails. That word consensus does enormous political work in Nigeria, and not in the direction most people assume. The 1999 Constitution does not define it. INEC guidelines do not regulate it. A consensus process is whatever the party's internal apparatus decides it is. And right now, the men holding the procedural levers of the ADC are National Chairman David Mark and National Secretary Rauf Aregbesola. These are not neutral administrators. Mark carries deep PDP-era Northern Network obligations. Aregbesola carries a political history so tangled, former Tinubu ally, APC stalwart, now inside the primary opposition platform, that his presence in the ADC's leadership structure alone raises questions about whose interests a managed consensus would actually serve. So when Atiku says he wants consensus, what he's actually saying is this: I have the largest declared northern bloc. Measure that at the consensus table, acknowledge my dominance, and we can avoid a primary I might not win among southern delegates. His exact words in the Arise interview were, "Can you name a northern leader with more votes than me?" That is not public confidence. That is a negotiating position delivered on television. And Peter Obi's camp has read it precisely that way. The Obi-Kwankwaso movement, publicly unveiled in Abuja, with structures already built across all 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory, is not a campaign apparatus. Not yet. It is a pressure mechanism. Its message, translated from political into plain language, is this: if the consensus process is steered toward Atiku, we will force a direct primary. And in a genuine Southern delegate primary, the outcome is not predetermined. Think about who benefits from this standoff and who stands to lose. Atiku benefits from a quick consensus before the OK movement gains full structural momentum. Obi benefits from delay, from time, from the coalition's internal contradictions becoming visible enough to justify a primary. Kwankwaso is resisting the assumption that he would simply become someone's running mate. Amechi is watching, and every one of them is calculating whether the South-South, Jonathan's informal territory, is open or closed. Then consider the people who have said nothing. Yesem Wike, the FCT minister, has not commented on the Jonathan-Atiku exchange. Yesem Wike is the most operationally powerful political figure in the South-South at this moment. He has lines into Abuja Center, into River State machinery, into funding networks that cross party lines. His silence on this exchange is not neutral. It is a man watching the board before deciding which piece to move. If Jonathan's public humiliation consolidates around him, if the narrative hardens that Atiku disrespected a South-South former president and paid no price, Wike's calculation shifts. The PDP governors still holding state-level machinery are also watching. They have not committed to the ADC. They are waiting to see whether the ADC's candidate selection produces someone worth defecting toward or someone worth opposing. And there is one connection at the intersection of all of this, one figure whose political capital stretches across both northern establishment networks and the ADC's internal machinery, that makes the question of who truly controls the consensus process more complicated than the official names suggest. That connection, David Mark's specific network obligations, and what Aregbesola's presence in the ADC secretariat actually signals about the establishment's appetite to manage the opposition from within, is where this analysis is going. Stay with it.
Let's talk about what this means for Nigeria as a country, because this is not just about who wins an ADC primary. The federal balance between the center and the states in Nigeria has always been partially stabilized by the informal zoning arrangement. It It is not constitutional, it is not legally enforceable, but it has functioned as a pressure valve, a way of distributing the presidency geographically enough to prevent any single zone from feeling permanently excluded from power. Atiku's argument in the Arise TV interview was that the South has governed for 18 years since 1999 against the North's 10, and therefore the zoning logic actually favors a Northern president now. Analysts have already challenged those numbers depending on how you count Jonathan's partial first term, Yar'Adua's incomplete tenure, and acting presidency periods. The arithmetic produces different conclusions. When a candidate is publicly manipulating the zoning calculation on television, it is not a sign of confidence, it is a sign that the consensus framework is already under strain. And a consensus framework under strain does not quietly resolve itself. It breaks, sometimes loudly. For ordinary Nigerians, the economic stakes are direct. The entire opposition coalition's electoral argument rests on Tinubu's reforms being, in Atiku's own words, organized hardship dressed up as reform. The cost of living crisis, petrol prices, naira instability, food inflation, this is the soil in which every opposition candidacy grows right now. But here's the danger. When the opposition fractures over who gets the ticket, that economic anger has nowhere constructive to go. A fractured, distracted opposition in 2027 does not just lose, it hands Tinubu a victory he would not otherwise be able to earn on economic performance alone. The people who suffer most from that outcome are not Atiku or B or Kwankwaso. They are Nigerians whose votes and whose pain are being used as currency in this negotiation. There is also a security dimension that is almost never discussed in this context. If the South-South, particularly Jonathan's network, concludes that it has been publicly disrespected and that the coalition has no genuine space for South-South political leadership, the consequence is not just reduced voter turnout. Political demobilization in the Niger Delta and the security environment there have historically moved together. When communities feel excluded from legitimate power, the informal power structures fill the vacuum. This is not a hypothetical. It is a pattern visible in 2007, in 2015, and in the years following every cycle where South-South expectations were raised and then managed downward. Now, the connection that was deliberately left open earlier, the question of who controls the ADC's internal consensus architecture, can now be answered more precisely. David Mark brings to the ADC chairmanship a network of northern political obligations accumulated over decades in the PDP. Arigbesola brings something more paradoxical. A man whose entire political formation was inside the Tinubu machine, whose ideological and organizational roots are intertwined with the very presidency this coalition is trying to displace, is now serving as the ADC's national secretary. That is not a coincidence. That is either a strategic defection or a structural infiltration. And the difference between those two things will only become clear when the consensus process either produces a candidate Arigbesola's networks can work with or collapses in a way that benefits the status quo. Here's the data point that puts all of this in a frame most people have not considered. In 2015, the coalition that defeated Jonathan got 15 million votes by consolidating fragmented opposition into a single platform, the APC. In 2023, the fragmented opposition generated over 15 million combined votes across 3 candidates and still lost. The lesson the ADC coalition has drawn is that consolidation is the key. But consolidation requires someone to yield. And Atiku calling Jonathan incompetent is a message not just to Jonathan, it's a message to every South-South operator, every fence-sitting governor, and every potential ADC delegate watching. I am not the one who yields. Position yourselves accordingly.
Now, before we close, there is an argument being made on Atiku's behalf that deserves to be heard properly. Not dismissed, not caricatured, actually heard. The strongest version of Atiku's critique of Jonathan is not personal vindictiveness, it is institutional. Jonathan came to the federal presidency having never served in a federal executive cabinet position before becoming vice president. He was a zoology lecturer, then a state-level politician, elevated through an extraordinary sequence of circumstance and political accident. During his presidency, Boko Haram expanded to its peak territorial reach. The Chibok school abduction happened. A constitutional conference was convened and produced no outcome. These are matters of record. Experienced political figures in Nigeria across party lines, including within the South-South, acknowledge in private conversations that Jonathan's administration had genuine governance deficits. Atiku is not inventing a critique. He is saying publicly what many say privately. On the narrow factual question of whether Jonathan's tenure had serious governance challenges, Atiku is not wrong. But here is where the argument falls apart, and it falls apart on timing and function. Jonathan also achieved Nigeria's 2 UN Security Council non-permanent seats. He presided over one of the most significant democratic moments in African history, a peaceful incumbency defeat in 2015, where he conceded before final results were confirmed. Regional observers have credited that concession with preventing large-scale post-election violence. Whatever his governance deficits, and they were real, the reduction of that record to the word inexperienced, deployed on a campaign television interview in April 2026, is not political analysis, it is weaponization. And the evidence that it is weaponization rather than honest assessment is simple. Atiku has shared platforms, negotiated alliances, and engaged politically with Jonathan's networks for the better part of a decade. He has never raised this critique publicly, not in 2019, not in 2022, not in 2023. He raised it now, in the specific week when ADC coalition negotiations are at their most sensitive, when the question of who controls the South-South vote is the central variable in the coalition's viability. That timing is not coincidence, it is calculation. And here is the misconception most Nigerians watching this exchange have fallen into. This is not a story about Jonathan and Atiku. This is a story about Atiku and the South-South. Jonathan is not the target. He is the medium through which a message is being sent to Yese Wike, to Seriake Dixon, to every South-South political operator watching that their informal leader's credibility is contestable, that backing a challenger to Atiku within the ADC carries a cost, and that the coalition's terms are being set from the north. That is what inexperienced means in April 2026. It is not a character assessment, it is a territorial declaration. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. So where does this go from here? Let's talk about the next moves, because the next 90 days will determine whether the ADC becomes a genuine electoral threat to Tinubu or an expensive repetition of 2023's opposition failure. Atiku's next move is almost certainly to accelerate the consensus process. Having publicly diminished Jonathan, he now has a narrowing window before the South-South can formally organize around a counter-position. His camp will push for an early consensus decision, framed as party unity, framed as the mature choice of experienced politicians, before the Obi Kwankwaso movement gains enough structural momentum to credibly threaten a direct primary he is less certain in winning when southern delegates are fully counted. Watch for Atiku's allies to begin framing any resistance to early consensus as destabilization, as self-interest dressed up as principle.
Peter Obi's move is equally readable. He has stayed publicly silent on the Jonathan-Atiku exchange. That silence is tactical, not passive. The OK movement's infrastructure, all 36 states, the FTC, is a counter-positioning tool ready to activate at a time of Obi's choosing. Watch for Obi to re-enter the conversation through the South-South door. A visit to Bayelsa, a public statement that honors Jonathan's record without directly attacking Atiku. Something that signals to South-South delegates that there is an alternative to accepting a predetermined consensus outcome. If Obi makes that move effectively, he does not just compete for the ADC ticket, he reshapes the entire negotiation. And then there is Jonathan, the most significant variable in this story, and the one whose next signal nobody can fully predict. If he remains publicly neutral after being publicly labeled incompetent, his political currency diminishes. His silence will be read as acceptance, and South-South operators will adjust accordingly. But if he signals, even subtly, toward Obi, or simply declines to endorse the coalition's direction, the internal geometry of the ADC shifts fundamentally. Watch the frequency and framing of his public appearances between now and July. Watch whether he shares stages with ADC figures or deliberately keeps distance. His ambiguity right now is a political asset. Atiku chose to poke it. Whether Jonathan chooses to activate it is the strategic question nobody on the ADC side can currently answer. 3 specific signals every Nigerian watching this race should track. First, does the ADC schedule its consensus meeting before the OK movement formally presents its joint ticket recommendation? The sequencing of that decision will reveal whether the process is genuine or managed. Second, do David Mark and Aregbesolo set internal timelines that disadvantage any specific candidate? The procedural calendar is where the real power is exercised. And third, watch whether Tinubu's government makes any economic or security concession specifically targeting the South-South in the next few weeks. A Niger Delta development announcement, a budget release for South-South infrastructure, anything that could be read as a pre-election sweetener aimed at the exact bloc that Atiku just antagonized. Now, the question that opened this analysis: who benefits from Jonathan being publicly labeled incompetent at this precise moment in April 2026? Atiku benefits, but only if the move works. If it silences Jonathan's network, signals South-South operators that resistance is futile, and consolidates his position ahead of a consensus table he intends to control, then this was a ruthless and effective political calculation. But if it backfires, if it activates Jonathan's network against him, if it gives Obi the opening to position himself as the natural South-South ally within the ADC, if it makes the South-South feel that the coalition is, at its core, a northern power grab dressed in opposition clothing, then April 2026 may be remembered as the moment Atiku handed away his last and best chance at the Nigerian presidency. He's 80 years old. He has run 7 times. He has said on camera that 2027 is his final attempt. The entire architecture of everything he has built since 1993 is riding on this coalition, on this primary, on the next 90 days of political negotiation. And he chose to spend the opening capital of that final campaign attacking a former president whose goodwill he may need before this is over. And here is where Nigeria ends up if this trajectory continues. If the coalition fractures, if the South-South disengages, if 2027 becomes another 3-candidate race with fragmented opposition votes that add up to more than Tinubu's total but never land in a single column, a pattern will have completed itself. 3 consecutive elections in which the opposition's combined electoral strength exceeded the mandate of the ruling party, and 3 consecutive losses because no one in the opposition could resolve the question of who yields. The institutional consequence of that pattern is not just another Tinubu term, but a deepening public disbelief in electoral politics as a mechanism for change. And when people stop believing that their votes produce outcomes, they look for other ways to produce outcomes. That is not a small thing. That is the trajectory. So leave this in the comments. If the ADC produces an Atiku ticket, Tinubu wins again, and this is the 3rd consecutive failed coalition opposition campaign, what does that mean for the future of electoral politics in Nigeria? Not for Atiku, not for Obi, not for Tinubu, for Nigeria. I want to read your answers. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.